My mind's all blurry. I've got to give my brain a rest. Jean sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her black wavy hair. Me too. I'm beat. You'd think the professors would give us a break or something to start off the year, but instead, they're piling it on. You can say that again. Jean looked out through the curtains at the cold orange sky, then back at Peggy. Hey, Mrs. Miniver with Greer Carson is showing down at the Belvedere. What do you say we get the girls and walk down to the theatre? Leaning up on her elbow, Peggy pulled open the desk drawer, took out her coin purse and gave it a shake, jingling a few coins. Movies weren't in her tight budget, and she'd always respected her parents' warnings against letting herself be influenced by bad entertainment, but she'd heard good things about Mrs. Miniver and wanted a break. She smiled. Sure, I'm game. A gaggle of girls in long plaid skirts pressed around the box office under the incandescent glow of dozens of clear bulbs lining the theatre marquee and the entranceway. Inside, a cartoon had already begun as the ladies made their way through a row, bumping knees and spilling popcorn. Peggy plopped beside Jean and began watching the colour flick of Bugs Bunny taking on a Japanese soldier on a desert island. The scattered chuckles in the audience didn't surprise Peggy. It was rare to see any ASEANs in upstate New York, and anti-Japanese sentiment ran high in America. The cartoon Jap jumped into a Japanese fighter plane in hot pursuit of Bugs, only to discover that his plane was tied to a tree. Thrown out with his canopy, the pilot yelled pseudo-Japanese gibberish. As he parachuted down, Bugs flew up beside him in another plane and handed him a pile of junk, saying, "Here's some scrap iron for Japan, Moto, he, happy landings," as the pilot fell to the earth. A hefty man behind Peggy grunted to a friend, "Damn Japs. Like Halsey says, the only good Jap is a dead Jap." A chill ran over her skin, just like when she was in Japan with her father and felt the contempt of the Japanese man putting up the propaganda posters. She closed her eyes, trying to block out her surroundings. Jean crunched a mouthful of popcorn and leaned the box to Peggy. "Hey, Peg, are you okay? You feeling sick or something?" Peggy opened her eyes and did her best to smile. Yeah, I guess you could say that. Listen, I think I'm going to walk back. Don't worry about me. You have fun, okay? "I can come with you," Jean said. "No, that's all right. I'll be okay. I'll see you when you get back." Peggy walked down the sidewalk in the lonely air with her arms folded across her chest, pulling her sweater tightly, trying to keep out a coldness she still felt from inside the theatre, a penetrating chill she couldn't keep out. She shuddered at the thought of the cruelty of mankind. Why did people want to kill each other so badly? What's wrong with this world? She remembered her childhood friends in Japan and wondered how they were. Glancing up at the bright crescent moon, she wiped a tear onto the back of her hand. August 28, 1942. Shanghai, China. As the spectacled Japanese judge rustled a sheet of paper between his hands, Jake cocked his head and sighed impatiently. He and the 7 other prisoners had been summoned that morning, handcuffed and trucked to a new location, some type of military prison camp, and shoved into a small courtroom packed with armed guards and officers. In over 4 months he'd taken only 1 bath, and his hair and beard had been shaved only once. Like the others, he still was draped in the worn, smelly clothes he put on the morning they took to the air on April 18th. He was braced for the worst. The fact that no Japanese would look him in the eye added to the foreboding atmosphere. 5 judges in black robes sat behind a set of tables on a raised platform. The judge in the centre held the sheet of paper. To Jake, the judges looked ridiculous in their black wigs, yet they retained an air of dignity, making them appear even sillier. On a stretcher on the floor was Dean Hallmark, pilot of the Green Hornet. Too weak to stand, he drifted in and out of consciousness. He was a big man, referred to by the rest of the guys as Jungle Jim. But the starvation diet, beatings, heat and disease had gotten the best of him. Flies buzzed over his still body, but he didn't have the strength to wave them off. George Barr, the redhead, nearly collapsed and was given a seat. The 6 others stood at a wobbly attention. To Jake, it was obvious that this was a perfunctory exercise, and that whatever decision would be handed down from this trial had been made long ago and probably somewhere far away. Each of the captives had already been asked to tell his life story in miniature as the judges yawned and looked away. It had now come to the moment of truth, but like all other official business, it, too, was given in Japanese. The judge adjusted the reading glasses on the end of his nose. On April 18, 1942, the defendants, motivated by their sporting instincts and sense of glory, freely volunteered to attack Japan. Over their assigned targets, the defendants showed cowardice when confronted with opposition in the air and on the ground, and with the intent of killing and wounding innocent civilians and wreaking havoc on residences and other living quarters of no military significance whatsoever, together with other planes, did carry on indiscriminate bombing and strafing, thereby causing the death and injury of approximately 10 civilians and the destruction of numerous residences. The foregoing facts are based on the depositions made by the 8 defendants and the copy of the acknowledgement made by the Shanghai Military Police Unit in response to the request of Military Police Headquarters. Having signed confessions stating the same, the defendants have been found guilty as charged and are hereby sentenced to death by firing squad. The judge hammered his gavel, waking Jake from his fog. Jake leaned to the interpreter. What did he just say? "I'm sorry," the interpreter said. "The judge ordered you not be told." Jake's mouth fell open, and he turned to Bill on his left. After enduring the farce of a sham trial, he felt the least they could do was to tell them their verdict. Instead, the shackled men were silently shuffled outside by soldiers and into another structure where they were each shoved into separate 6-by-5-foot wooden cells. Defeated, Jake stood and watched the door close him into near-total darkness, listened to the wooden crossbar clunk into place, heard the key turn, the metal bolt slide, and the final clank of the lock. The guard momentarily peered back through the narrow slot in the door, looking him directly in the eyes, then walked away. The last meaningful thing Jake still had was finally taken away: his friends. October 15th, 1942. Qiangwan Military Prison, Shanghai, China. In a grass clearing beside a Chinese cemetery, Captain Tatsuta, the warden and commanding officer of the Qiangwan Military Prison, looked over the 3 condemned men, each with his hands tied behind his back. Lieutenant Bill Farrow, pilot of the Bat Out of Hell, Sergeant Harry Spatz, gunner, and Lieutenant Dean Jungle Jim Hallmark, pilot of the Green Hornet. As the warden, he knew it was his duty, yet at the same time had come to know and even respect the men he was now ordered to execute. He struggled with how best to put their minds at ease before they breathed their last. The sound of soldiers hammering echoed in the otherwise silent yard. 3 small, newly constructed wooden crosses were tapped into the ground behind the prisoners. 6 rifled soldiers stood at attention beside a small table burning incense. 2 doctors in white were off to the side, while 3 other soldiers stood guard. A late afternoon breeze ruffled the untucked shirt-tails of the 3 prisoners. Tatsuta had been informed that, in a gesture of mercy from the Emperor, only 3 of the 8 captive flyers were to be shot. The others were to be kept in solitary confinement until some final decision was made on what to do with them, pending the development of the war. The day before, he gave each of the 3 men pens and paper to write out their final words, goodbyes, and last requests to those they loved. Perhaps most excruciating were the words from Bill Farrow to his fiancée, Lib Sims, a girl he promised to marry as soon as he was home again, which they both expected would be a month or 2 after his brief mission. An officer read off the charges in Japanese, followed by an interpreter who summarized the charges in English. When complete, they both bowed and stepped to the side. Tatsuta walked up to the 3 men and spoke in English, first looking them one by one, eye to eye. "I feel sorry for you. Your lives were short, but your names will be remembered forever." Bill stood uprightly and fully raised his head. "Tell the folks back home we died bravely. Will you?" "Capt." Tatsuta nodded. He gathered his courage and gave to his prisoners the best he had to offer. "Christ died on a cross, and you on your part must die on a cross as well. But when you are executed, when you die on your cross, you will be honoured as gods." He hoped, in some way, to give them the most honourable deaths, according to their beliefs, to the best of his understanding. When you are bound to the cross, your faith and the cross will be united. Therefore, have faith. Perhaps this would give them some hope in death, he thought. "Do you have anything else to say?" Bill, Harry and Dean looked at each other. Bill shook his head. Captain Tatsuta bowed deeply to the airman, stood upright and then nodded to the soldiers who guided each man to his cross, pushed him down into a kneeling position, and tied his arms to the horizontal crossbar with another loop of rope to hold up his head to the centre post. Each man was blindfolded with a white strip of cloth. Another soldier carefully painted a round black dot in the centre of the blindfold over the centre each man's forehead. When the soldiers returned to their positions, Tatsuta waited, then called out in Japanese, "Attention! Face the target!" The soldiers in 2 rows of 3 each turned 90 degrees toward the prisoners. With a clean motion, Tatsuta drew his sabre from its scabbard with his right hand and thrust it into the air as the afternoon sun gleamed off the bloody. This was his duty, and he wouldn't hesitate. "Prepare!" The first row of 3 drew their rifles to their shoulders, cocked the steel bolts in unison, and aimed at the black marks on the blindfolds. The second row of gunners was prepared in the event the first marksman's weapon misfired or he missed. With his sabre still raised in his right hand, Tatsuta raised his left hand into the air and held it stationary for several seconds. He looked away from the men to the horizon, then dropped his left hand. "Fire!" A cluster of 3 shots reverberated through the cemetery grounds as the 3 limp bodies slumped forward and the blood trickled down their faces, dripping onto the dust below. The 2 doctors in white walked toward the victims. Their letters were never mailed. The following morning, Jake found himself handcuffed and escorted to a common courtyard by impeccably dressed armed soldiers. He saw others carrying new shovels. It didn't look good. He and the other 4 prisoners were ordered to wash in a trough. Although forbidden to speak to his fellow prisoners, one look of the eyes told him they were all thinking the same thing. This was the end. Jake casually measured the height of the walls, glancing bottom to top, too high to climb over. Soon they were prompted to line up and were escorted back into the same tiny military courtroom they were in almost 2 months earlier, standing before the same judges with their same ridiculous wigs. 15 armed soldiers surrounded the 5 gaunt, bearded prisoners. Everything in Jake wanted to believe that their 3 missing buddies had been transferred somewhere else, but he knew better. Now it was his turn to hear why, when, and how he and the others would be executed. Shot, beheaded, Japs were scum. The centre judge nodded to a heavy-set officer holding several sheets of paper in trembling hands, sweating profusely. He wiped his face with a handkerchief, then began in English. "It has been proven beyond all doubt that the defendants, motivated by a false sense of glory, carried on indiscriminate bombing of schools and hospitals, and machine-gunned innocent civilians with complete disregard for the rules of war." Jake seethed, hearing the trumped-up charges for the first time in the kangaroo court. The Japanese knew full well they'd hit military targets. It didn't really matter what he was saying anymore. They had their verdict and only wanted to find some reasons to prop it up. It was all whitewashed propaganda now. Great beads of sweat dripped down the side of the reader's face. "The tribunal, acting under the law, hereby sentences the defendants to death." "You sons of bitches!" Chase Nielsen shouted as a bayoneted rifle quickly guided him back in line. Jake clenched his teeth. Soldiers gripped their rifles more firmly. "But, through the graciousness of His Majesty, the Emperor, your sentences are hereby commuted to life imprisonment with special treatment." The officer exhaled deeply and once again wiped the perspiration from his face. Jake had spent the last 2 months in solitary confinement, 23.5 hours each day, eating rotten fish heads and maggot-infested rice, and picking lice from his hair, yet a strange sense of joy breezed over him. Moments earlier, he'd been totally resigned to immediate death. The soldiers marched the prisoners back to their cells and closed them back in, one at a time. Jake's eyes penetrated the wooden walls that had become his only friend. The idea of freedom was 1,000,000 miles away. But even if he hoped to survive to the end of the war, he knew he'd be executed before he'd ever be turned over to the Americans. His life sentence seemed more of a delayed death penalty, but at least he was still alive, for now. December 1942. Madras, Oregon. "Oh my!" Mrs. Andrus admiringly lifted up a certificate to the light as she sat at the kitchen table with Glenn, his 3 sisters, and Mr. Andrus huddled around her. "Jake's been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross." Mr. Andrus smiled. He knew he didn't mean it, but he wished he did. "Look at that," Helen said. "Who would have ever believed it?" Glenn asked. "My big brother." "Well, I'm going to put this right next to his picture on my dresser." Mrs. Andrus turned to her husband. "Hiram, you find us a nice frame, will you?" Mr. Andrus reached out his farm-worn hand and gently grasped the sheet of paper. "I'll do it tomorrow?" He smiled at his wife, then looked at the children, who glanced at each other, carefully trying not to spoil their mother's dream that somehow Jake was still alive. There had been no word about Jake or any of the downed raiders since the public news about the raid 8 months earlier. Nothing. Mr. Andrus knew that no news was bad news. He smiled again. "I'll have it up for you tomorrow." December 1942. Hopevale. Under tall trees in the warm, humid morning air, Jimmy stood before 60 or so people singing together in their open-air church, sitting on seats of stacked stones in a semicircle beneath overhanging trees. Local Filipinos, students from the college, and some miners, all joined the dozen or so missionaries and teachers who made their home in Hopevale and the nearby village of Katipunan. Frank played away on the foot-pumped reed organ while Jimmy led into the final stanza at the front, beside a rock altar with a makeshift cross adorned with a large bouquet of wildflowers at the base. He proclaimed every word with honesty. "In Christ now meet both East and West. In him meet South and North. All Christ-like souls are one in him throughout the whole wide earth." The final notes of the organ held, then stopped and reverberated through the trees. Jimmy patted his face with a rag. The return to near silence was broken by the squeals of a family of macaque monkeys from the boughs above. "I thank you all for making the hike to be with us this morning. You can visit any time you'd like. God's best to you." As the meeting broke up, a weathered middle-aged Filipina woman with her daughter carrying a burlap sack approached Jimmy. The 12-year-old girl held out the bag and spoke in her best English, "Cassava roots and rice, for you and friends." "Thank you so much," Jimmy said, as he leaned in and gave the young girl a gentle hug. "We couldn't survive without the love and help of people like you and your mother." The woman shook Jimmy's hand and wouldn't let go as she looked around at the encompassing green foliage. "It's so strange that the most beautiful church I've been in has no walls." She looked Jimmy in the eyes. "But isn't that the way it should be? Different people, one God, no walls between any?" Jimmy was humbled by her simple insight. He thought it ironic that it took a brutal war that divided nations to bring their small band of various people in the mountains so close together. He smiled. No walls between anyone is good. Jenny sat on the step in front of her hut under the watchful eyes of a concerned Filipino father as she wrapped a grass strand around a bamboo splint on a young boy's finger. Chama held his palm steady. "Leave this on, okay? Don't take it off. Come back next week and I'll look at it. It's going to be okay." She looked up at his relieved father. "Don't let him take it off for anything, and make sure—" "Hey, hey, hey!" Chalmer said, just as she glanced over her shoulder in time to catch a macaque dragging off a small bunch of bananas from a hutch. "Come back here, you rascal!" Jenny put her hands on her hips and smiled as the monkey disappeared into the jungle. "You know, that's really impolite. Next time, just ask," she shouted. Chalmer brushed some dirt from her arm. "I guess he's hungry too." December 28, 1942, Hope Valley. Jimmy anxiously watched Jack as he dialed in a dented, battery-powered shortwave radio as the entire Hopevale group stood silently in front of Jimmy's place. Half a dozen Filipinos and 4 other armed guerrillas joined the audience, 2 white and 2 Filipino men. Besides their weapons, the guerrillas were often identified by their wavy-brimmed khaki jungle hats. Jack and another gold miner turned guerrilla helped maintain the radio for the Hopevale people, as it was their only connection to the outside world. Jimmy was waiting to hear a speech by President Roosevelt. A very important one. It had been just over a year since the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, when he was confident that the war wouldn't last more than 6 months. He was also certain the Japanese would never attack the Philippines, and even more certain that they would never take it. Now, he wasn't certain of anything, but like everyone else, he was impatient to hear exactly what the United States was going to do, and even more importantly, when. He'd heard a lot of promises of rescue, but he really wanted to hear it from the president himself. Through a high-frequency hum and crackle of interference, President Roosevelt's voice sounded through the speaker in his halting, deliberate tone. "As President of the United States, I know that I speak for all our people on this solemn occasion. The resources of the United States, of the British Empire, of the Netherlands East Indies, and of the Chinese Republic have been dedicated by their people to the utter and complete defeat of the Japanese warlords." Chalmer folded her arms. Jimmy stood motionless with one ear facing the radio, carefully examining the meaning of each word. In this great struggle of the Pacific, the loyal Americans of the Philippine Islands are called upon to play a crucial role. They have played, and they are playing tonight, their part with the greatest gallantry. As President, I wish to express to them my feeling of sincere admiration for the fight they are now making. Jack glanced across at a Filipino guerrilla who gave a slight grin. His dark skin was slick with sweat, and his eyes beamed confidence. The loosely banded guerrillas had already introduced themselves to the Japanese by a series of random hit-and-run attacks near the Villa copper mines in Sibalom, about 15 miles to the southwest, extracting heavy losses and disrupting the Japanese operations. The people of the United States will never forget what the people of the Philippine Islands are doing this day and will do in the days to come. I give to the people of the Philippines my solemn pledge that their freedom will be redeemed and their independence established and protected. The entire resources, in men and in material, of the United States stand behind that pledge. Frank put his hands on his hips and glanced at Jimmy with a nod of confident hope. "It is not for me or for the people of this country to tell you where your duty lies. We are engaged in a great and common cause. I count on every Philippine man, woman, and—" A loud, distinct bird call rang out from a tree, from a lookout whistling loudly, a signal Jimmy well knew meant that Japanese forces were somewhere in the area. As the Filipino boy whistled again, even louder, Jack shut off the radio and shoved it into the hut under a mat as everyone fled to their designated hideouts. Chalmer doused the cooking fire with a bucket of sand as Jimmy grabbed a bag of mangoes and headed out behind Frank and Gertrude into the deep foliage. They never knew how long they'd be hiding and had to be prepared for a long wait. Even though they'd been barefoot for nearly their entire stay, they still had to walk gingerly over the rocks and muddy ground through the woods to their cave. Running wasn't an option without severe consequences. In a tree above, the boy looked through binoculars down on a group of 22 Japanese soldiers about a mile away in the valley below, hacking through bamboo near a path, stopping and pointing, unfolding a map, and pointing again. Jimmy tripped over a vine but caught himself as the four of them clambered into the small grotto. Charmer pulled the vines back over the opening as the others leaned against the cool stone walls and did their best to make as little noise as possible while breathing heavily and listening. Reaching down to his foot, Jimmy plucked a leaf stuck between his toes and noticed a fresh gash on his leg. "I didn't hear FDR say when they're coming," Jimmy whispered. "Did you?" Frank forced a grin. "Whenever it is, it won't be a day too soon. I can tell you that." This was the second time they'd fled to the cave. The location seemed pretty remote to the locals and certainly to Jimmy, but the guerrillas had stirred up a hornet's nest by their successful attacks, and the Japanese weren't willing to wait for the next one. They were determined to take the fight to the guerrillas once they'd found their center of operations. Jimmy's hope was simply that the Americans would take the island before the Japanese found them out. They'd been as close as a half-mile before, but the jungle was so dense it was hard to see a footpath even 10 feet away. Jimmy felt they were as safe as they could be. "Wait," Charmer whispered. "Listen." Each froze as they strained to hear. It was the second bird call, the all-clear sound from the lookout. Charmer put her hand to her chest and sighed with relief. "This isn't fun anymore. I just want to go back home, to our home in Yokohama." "You know," Jimmy said, "it's possible that we could run into a student we were teaching just a few years ago." As he parted the draped vines, he looked back at the group and paused. "I wonder if he'd shoot me." Early April 1943. Rabaul Air Base, the Australian territory of New Guinea. Fuchida looked out through an observation window of a twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M bomber, what the Americans called a Betty, as it descended toward a grass and dirt runway at the airbase. Mountain ridges and a smouldering volcano hemmed in the base against the large oval bay scattered with cruisers, destroyers, and cargo vessels. Fuchida was fascinated by the sight of black volcanic soil contrasting with the lush green foliage and the cerulean blue water. Only 6 years earlier, the city of Rabaul had been buried in ash from the eruption of 2 volcanoes, from volcanic vents on both sides of the bay, itself the caldera of an ancient volcano. Flying past rows of fighters and bombers, most camouflaged with palm fronds, the plane touched down in a streak of grey dust and came to a rolling stop beside a virtual tent city. The base was home to over 100,000 Japanese troops and served as the continuous launching point for both air and sea operations in the region. Limited to desk jobs by his broken ankles still in casts, Fuchida had been devoting himself to reviewing past battles and presenting his analyses to the Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo. He'd been out of the field since the Battle of Midway 9 months earlier and was anxious to see and hear firsthand the state of operations, and perhaps to meet with Admiral Yamamoto as well. The round red Hinomaru on the fuselage side swung in as a door, and the soldiers and officers began disembarking. Doing his best with his casts, Fuchida had 2 men help him to the ground and hand him his crutches. "Welcome, old man," Gender said, standing behind a wheelchair, grinning widely. "Old man, these are battle wounds." "Of an old man. Have a seat." Gender wheeled the chair behind Fuchida, who reluctantly sat back and laid his crutches across his lap. As they began across the taxiway, Fuchida looked over at the nearby volcano, Tavurvur, spewing smoke. "Are things as bad down here as they're saying in Tokyo?" Gender didn't answer for a while as he kept pushing. "No." A breeze of dust blew over from a fighter noisily taxiing by. "They're worse." Fuchida looked back up at Gender. Inside Gender's one-room officer's quarters, Fuchida emptied a glass of beer as Gender bent the cap off another bottle of Asahi lager and sat down. The sound of aircraft taking off and landing droned in the background. "Yamamoto was bitterly disappointed with Guadalcanal," Gender said. "We thought that 2,500 men could hold the island and control the airfield." Gender refilled both their glasses and set the bottle next to a row of empties. "He truly believed we could win that battle. We all did. We threw everything into it. Gender took a sip and stared at the wall. After 30,000 men and 5 months of fighting, we still couldn't retake the airfield, much less the island. We were annihilated. But what about the future? What about plans for a decisive battle? Fuchida said. The past was done, Fuchida thought. Best to get on with the business at hand. Gender shook his head. Even though we still have more aircraft carriers than the Americans, for now anyway, we had to send 2 carriers back home, for lack of skilled pilots. Upset, but also a bit lightheaded, Fuchida pounded his fist. I warned them to stop using our best pilots in battle and to hold some back for training, but no one would listen. Now it's almost too late. Fuchi, Gender said as he shook his head despondently. Do you realize that over half of the pilots who flew to Pearl Harbor are gone? More than half? Well, we're producing enough aircraft. I know. I see the reports. I just wish they'd send more planes to the Navy and fewer to the Army in China. We'll have more pilots, but it'll take some time. Gender took a long drink and smacked his lips. Yamamoto wants to see things as well. He'll be here in 2 days and will make an assessment. He'll know what to do. Gender raised his half-empty beer glass to Fuchida, who did likewise. To victory under Yamamoto. Fuchida put on his best face, but could read the doubt in Gender's eyes. To victory. They downed their beer. The following day, Fuchida and Gender made the rounds touring the hangars, conversing with the pilots and listening to their adventures as they pointed to bullet holes in their wings and complained about low-octane fuel and faulty radio equipment. Fuchida knew what the reports were, but now he wanted to know the truth, and the truth was bad. Still, he believed they could regroup, resupply, and make a strong showing to at least stop the American advance somewhere. A few days later, after Yamamoto had met with the base commanders and was briefed on operations, Fuchida was called to Yamamoto's quarters on Residency Hill, as it was called, a white stucco house overlooking the bay. The two of them met in his front room of large red terracotta floor tile, Fuchida on a wicker sofa in his summer khakis, and Yamamoto in a wicker chair in his dress whites. Fuchida knew that the Admiral's presence boosted morale, but he also knew it was a risk for him to be so close to the action. Before we began to fight the Americans, Yamamoto said, I remember when the Navy would say that one Zero fighter could take on 10 American aircraft. Even now they still say that one Zero can take on 2 enemy planes. What do you think? Fuchida could see he was being tested by the master strategist. Sir, our men have shown tremendous fighting spirit and skill, but we might have been wiser overestimating our enemy and underestimating our own strength. Yamamoto nodded once, looked out across the bay, snapped shut his cigarette case, and tapped a cigarette against it a couple of times before putting it to his mouth. The Third Fleet now has fewer than 100 fighters, 60 dive bombers, and a handful of torpedo planes. He lit the cigarette, blew out the match, and turned back to Fuchida. The fleet's been gutted. It was a bit of a surprise for Fuchida to hear Yamamoto speak so freely and to cast doubts about the future, a future that was clouding for Fuchida as well. Yet he knew Yamamoto understood that nothing other than brutal honesty would do and was hunting for ideas. Fuchida grabbed his crutches, struggled to his feet, and shuffled to a wall map. Yamamoto twisted to watch. Fuchida swept his finger along a vertical string of islands in the open ocean, 700 miles south of Japan and 700 west of the Philippines. Here, Fuchida looked back at Yamamoto. I suggest we establish a firm line of air and surface defense along the Mariana Islands, one which the Americans can never cross. The Americans have 24 heavy carriers nearly completed, Yamamoto said. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines as well. He took a slow drag from his cigarette and blew a cloud of smoke up toward the ceiling. Eventually, they will come. What we lack in carriers we can strengthen with island air bases. Fuchida wanted to recapture the confidence he once had, but the wind simply wasn't in his sails. I strongly believe that we must not allow the Americans to occupy Saipan and the islands, which would put them within striking distance of our homeland, a situation that is simply unacceptable. I've come to the same conclusion. We must make a stand there and control the skies over the Marianas. If we can concentrate our forces and draw out the Americans, we have a chance for a significant victory. Yamamoto stood up. I'll see that you have what you need to establish more bases. As he shook his hand, Yamamoto's face looked somber. The enemy has been quicker to learn from their failures than we've been to learn from our successes. We mustn't make the same mistake again. He escorted Fuchida to the open double doors at the entryway and looked out at the bay. At Guadalcanal, we were mistaken about the Americans and found ourselves completely unprepared for their fighting spirit. Now that we know who they are, we must let them know who we are. April 19, 1943, Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Staring at several stacks of paper on his desk, Fuchida sighed heavily, slid one stack to the side and pulled another toward him, and began leafing through the top sheets. Hearing fast, heavy footsteps, he looked up, waiting to see who would appear. Genda arrived breathing heavily, his face rather pale. Fuchida knew it was bad news, very bad news. "They got him," Genda said plainly. "Yamamoto. He's dead." Fuchida's ears tingled as a wave shot through him head to toe. How? What happened? The Imperial Navy had lost its greatest living commander, a giant to all who knew him. The respect he commanded had gone with him to his grave, forever. Yesterday, near Bougainville. Genda motioned for Fuchida to follow him to a map room. Fuchida jumped up from his desk, grabbed his crutches, and moving as quickly as possible rushed out behind him through a hallway into another room. Genda put his finger on Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain and dragged it southeast below the island of Bougainville. He and Commander Ugaki left in 2 medium attack bombers escorted by 6 fighters to tour bases to encourage the men before he returned to Tokyo, but about 90 minutes after takeoff they were attacked by a group of American P-38 twin-engine fighters. High-speed, long-range aircraft. Fuchida was puzzled. That doesn't look like a place for a routine American patrol. How many P-38s? The information is still coming in, but the fighter escorts reported 12 P-38s. 12? Genda looked at Fuchida. They both thought the same thing. "An ambush!" Fuchida breathed out. "We can't be sure at this point, but it looks like the Americans may have been waiting." Fuchida shook his head. "The Americans will know our every move if our codes have been broken. Something the Naval General Staff refuses to believe possible. They believe the code is unbreakable." Fuchida stared, expressionless. He'd seen what the overconfidence of the Naval Command had led them into at Midway. Even he'd been infected by the same victory disease from their string of sweeping conquests throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But heavy doses of reality had brought him around, and he feared those who still clung to wishful dreams of invincibility. "Didn't anyone try to dissuade the Admiral?" Vice Admiral Ozawa begged him not to go, but Yamamoto was determined to visit his men. "Perhaps," Fuchida said. "It's fitting for the Admiral to end his days beside those he led." "Perhaps," Genda acknowledged. "But who can take his place now?" April 23, 1943. Madras, Oregon. Standing at the kitchen table next to his younger sister Helen, Glenn rubbed his whiskers and stared down soberly at the Oregon Journal with the screaming headline, "American Raiders of Tokyo Executed by Enemy Captors." The news had shot across the Pacific Ocean like lightning to every home in America and to the White House itself, provoking outrage in the newspapers and radio, denunciation of savagery, and vows of revenge. But to Jake's family, it was a stab to the heart. Helen fell onto Glenn's shoulder in sobs. Outside, Mr. and Mrs. Andrus stood before a sea of anxious reporters crowding for position, pinning them to a fence. Mr. Andrus stood protectively close to his wife as she fielded another question from an eager reporter. "I heard it on the radio yesterday," she said, "when President Roosevelt made the announcement." The day before, the Japanese officially disclosed that the Doolittle raiders had been severely punished, that all had been put on trial, found guilty of killing innocent civilians, had been justly sentenced to death, and that some had been executed, but without specifying exactly who, though mixed reports had trickled out, it left an air of confusion. To the frustration of the American government, Japan also refused to allow neutral Swiss representatives to visit the men, insisting that they weren't prisoners at all, but rather war criminals. The Japanese gave a warning over the airwaves to all Americans to make sure every flyer that comes here has a special pass to hell, and rest assured it's strictly a one-way ticket. President Roosevelt immediately pledged that the warlords of these diabolical crimes would be brought to justice, further stating that the United States government would hold personally and officially responsible all officers of the Japanese government who have participated in this act of barbarity. An American official tersely stated that revenge will come in due course. Waving his pencil for attention, another reporter blurted out, Ma'am, what do you think of the reports listing your son as one of those who've been executed?" Mrs. Andrus glanced at her husband, who put his arm around her. "Well, until last night we didn't worry much about Jacob. He's always been able to take care of himself. But since we heard the latest news—" She was doing her best to keep her emotions in check, but began to succumb. "Well, I'm afraid he may be dead now." As the reporters unleashed a new flurry of questions, Mr. Andrus saw the toll it was taking, raised his hand and leaned forward with the authority of a trainer pulling his fighter from a match. "That's it, fellas. I'm sorry, but that's all for now. No more questions. Thanks. Thanks very much." The sweltering, dusty day melted into a deep orange sunset, then faded into a dark night. Late in the evening, the starry sky and near full moon washed the silhouettes of the house, barns and fences in a deep cold blue. A soft yellow glowed through the curtains of a single window of the Andrus farmhouse. All was still, all was quiet, but for the empty sound of crickets and the muffled, distant sound of the uncontrolled sobbing of a bereaved mother. Early the next morning the sun broke through the sky over the eastern mountain ridge and glazed the front porch in gold. Mr. Andrus carried 2 blue-speckled enamelled cups of steaming coffee out through the screen door. Mrs. Andrus sat rocking in her high-back chair, staring at the distant mountains, creaking the wooden deck with each rock. As he held the cup to his wife, she looked up with a smile and an unusual appearance of contentment. "Thank you, dear." She blew across her cup, took the slightest sip, and sat back and slowly rocked some more, still with a peaceful grin. Mr. Andrus gently set his cup on the table between them and sat down, keeping his eye on his wife, mystified by her demeanour, even wondering about her sanity. "Jake's not dead," she stated flatly, then slowly sipped again. Sunlight flooded the master bedroom as well, illuminating their oak dresser and faded yellow and green flowered wallpaper, marred and stained by time. On the lace runner draped over the dresser stood a framed black and white photo of Jake as a boy holding 2 puppies in front of a picket fence. Beside it was a picture of Jake and Glenn in a field with their arms behind their backs, squinting into the sun. It was the last photo Mrs. Andrus had of Jake, taken the last time he was home in April 1941. Next was a smaller framed shot of Jake's high school portrait, a serious picture of Jake in a herringbone patterned coat and a dark tie. Then there was the black and gold framed certificate of the Distinguished Flying Cross with its hexagonal gold medal hanging by a red, white and blue striped ribbon from the top right corner of the frame. Pinned with thumbtacks, a collection of newspaper clippings adorned the wall with titles of "Jake's a Hero in His Hometown" and "Local Boy Helps Bomb Tokyo," with his same military portrait repeated in article after article. Another clipping read, "Corporal de Shazer identified in picture," showing him in China cowering on the steps among his fellow captured comrades. But at the bottom, far right of the compilation pinned to the wall with silver thumbtacks, was a newly added scrap of torn paper with handwritten words in blue ink. "This is what the Lord says. Refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears. They will return from the land of the enemy. So there is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children will return to their own land." Jeremiah 31-16. Below that, in larger letters, were the bold words, "Praise the dear Lord, April 23rd, 1943. On the front porch, Mrs. Andrus stopped rocking and stared at the horizon. "Isn't the sky just lovely this morning? Early July, 1943. Tama Rayan Cemetery, Tokyo." Fuchida cupped his hands around a smouldering stick of incense and gently blew on the glowing ember. For a moment the breeze calmed, letting the curls of smoke rise before the 8-foot-tall speckled grey granite column engraved with the name Isoroku Yamamoto. He slowly stood and eyed the stately column from top to bottom, as if he were venerating the admiral himself, his gaze finally resting on the bouquet of white chrysanthemums he had placed in the stone vase. He stood before the monument with 2 other officers, the 3 deciding to pay their respects to their fallen leader. The fact that Yamamoto's plane had been downed on April 18th, exactly 1 year to the day of the Doolittle raid on Japan, seemed like a very bad omen to him. Perhaps it was fate. So long as Yamamoto commanded the combined fleet, Fuchida had always believed that victory was within reach. Though he couldn't speak his thoughts to others, he was now convinced that all was lost. Yet he gathered his strength, clasped his hands before him, closed his eyes, and bowed his head to Yamamoto's spirit. He vowed to fully devote himself to the destruction of the American forces and to the protection of the homeland of Japan, the nation he loved and lived for, and was equally willing to die for. The preceding day, Fuchida had stood beside Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta before the Emperor Hirohito, as Kakuta was installed as the new commander-in-chief of the First Air Fleet. Fuchida had been appointed as Kakuta's senior staff officer. With his greater authority, Fuchida felt an even greater responsibility. A sense of finality had swept over him. If the new First Air Fleet failed, then all of Yamamoto's achievements, all of Fuchida's efforts, all of the work and suffering and death of the forces of Japan would have been in vain. A thought that was crushing for him to even contemplate. Standing erect, Fuchida opened his eyes, surprised they were blurred by the tears clinging to his eyelashes. At the state funeral, the motto had been, "Follow Yamamoto." He wanted nothing more than to follow Yamamoto into a new era of Japan. But now, this stone monument over a silent grave made clear the destination of those who will follow him. July 1943, Hope Vale. Among a small garden of waist-high cornstalks, Jimmy yanked out a few more weeds, put his hands on his back, and winced as he stood upright in the muddy row under a blazing sun, then heard someone coming his way. Jack strode up with loads of goods slung over both shoulders. Jimmy headed for the shade of a mahogany tree and sat his aching body down. "Good afternoon." "And a good day to you, my friend," Jimmy replied, fanning his face with his hat. Jack came into the shadow of the great tree and swung 2 drab-green canvas bags off one shoulder and 3 brand-new M1 Garand rifles and a well-worn machine gun off the other. Most men would have a hard time lifting the 80 pounds of goods that Jack seemed to carry with ease. He squatted down and dug into his bag. "Think quick," he said as he started throwing things into the air for Jimmy to catch. A roll of cotton gauze, a paper package of disinfectant, and a packet of razor blades. He held up a pack of cigarettes and shook them. "Don't think you want these." He dropped them into his pocket, then reached back in and tossed out a package of tetanus antitoxin and paused. "Ah, here we go." Pulling out a handful of 5 small bars, he reached out to Jimmy and dropped them into his hand. Jack smiled. Chocolate. All this stuff came in by submarine on the North Shore at night. Jack pulled out another chocolate bar and held it up to Jimmy's face. "Look at this." Jimmy leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and read the imprinted label out loud. "I shall return, General Douglas MacArthur." Below the General's handwritten signature in smaller letters, it read, "General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief Southwest Pacific Theatre," and beside it, 2 tiny coloured flags crossed over, of the US and the Philippines. He looked into Jack's sweat-drenched face. I like that a lot. Thanks." His fainting hope seemed to resuscitate. Jack held up a box of matches with the same emblem. "Matches, too. I'll take this medical stuff to Fred and Jenny. Just thought you'd like to see it first." Jack picked up a rifle, sat beside Jimmy, and carefully dusted it with his hand. "You want some weapons?" Jimmy smiled as he gently shook his head and tucked one of the bars into his pocket. "I really think you could use 'em up here, all by yourself, you know. Just might buy you some time when you need it most. The book says that those who take up the sword will die by the sword." Pausing for a second, Jack said, "Or maybe those without swords just get killed." Jack waited for some response, but there was only silence. "So you don't fight?" Years before in Japan, Jimmy had explored the many aspects of war and peace. He'd heard every argument for and against, and had come to his own conviction that it just wasn't the highest path, but he sometimes had a hard time clearly communicating his reckoning. He also felt conflicted at times because, of all people, he certainly wanted someone to come and drive the Japanese off the island. Jimmy took the rifle from Jack and ran his hand over it. Still examining the weapon, he said, "We fight, but our weapons don't kill people." He handed the rifle back and looked Jack in the eyes. "They bring dead people back to life." Jack nodded and grinned. They both understood each other, liked each other, and respected each other, but they both knew neither would change the mind of the other. Jack stood back up, collected the rifles and bags, and heaved them back onto his sturdy shoulders. "I'll keep using mine until I learn how to use yours." Jimmy looked up. "Jack, you're a very strong man, a powerful man, but one day you may find yourself in a position where all your strength just isn't enough, and you'll see how weak you really are. How weak we all are, really. Me and the boys'll be staying the night here, then we'll head out tomorrow morning." Jimmy gave a casual salute with a smile. "Thanks for taking care of us up here." "My pleasure." "Listen, Jack, can you get some letters out if I get them to you? You know, by submarine." "Sure, no problem." July 1943. Japanese Headquarters. Iloilo City, Panay. Lieutenant General Kawano, a new leader on the island, meticulously adjusted the fingers of his white gloves as he stood beside a glistening black 1941 Chrysler Saratoga, a rare luxury car on the island, a car formerly owned by a prominent physician whose home they had taken over and converted into a headquarters. A soldier opened the passenger door for the general and waited. The commander's party stood next to a small detachment of soldiers on a circular gravel driveway of the estate just outside the city, under the scattered shade of mature palm trees. Japanese colours flew on flagstaffs on either side of the brick-stepped entryway into the manor house. "Commander," the base officer said to the general, "you may want to consider an armoured personnel carrier for your initial tour." He bowed and held out a hand toward an ugly behemoth of a machine, a 612-ton Type 1 Ho-Ha half-track, 18 feet of camouflage-painted heavy metal with room for 3 in the cab featuring small hinged plates for windows. Armed with 3 machine guns, the vehicle had room in the back for another 12 soldiers. Some areas of the city can be dangerous, especially the outlying areas. Lieutenant General Kawano had been sent specifically to this island to mop up the end of the guerrilla resistance. The Japanese army had effectively subdued the fighters on the other Philippine islands, more or less, but the preceding commander on Panay had failed to complete the job. Kawano viewed the guerrillas as little more than pests who were interfering with the establishment of Japanese rule, and he was fiercely committed to carrying out his orders. But first, he simply wanted to get a feel for the island. As a master with the sword and bayonet, he also had a matching reputation for impatient ruthlessness and cold efficiency. Kawano gave a quick glance at the rusty half-track and brushed a speck of lint off his breast pocket. That won't be necessary. The base officer glanced cautiously at the squad of soldiers. No one would dare venture to contradict the general, especially in the presence of the assistants he'd brought with him, who sat waiting in the back seat of the idling sedan, looking forward to an afternoon of touring. Holding his scabbard, Kawano ducked his head and sat down as a soldier closed the door behind him with a crisp clunk. The driver shifted into gear and pulled out over the crackling gravel driveway under the gaze of the officer and his detachment of soldiers. After an hour or so of exploring in the city proper, Kawano directed his driver to the west side of the city. Observing street vendors holding out mangoes and coconuts to his vehicle as they navigated down the streets, the city was getting along, business as usual. The windshield shattered with a blast as gunshots rang out and the vehicle careened into a newspaper stand, sending papers flying and halting into a wall. As the streets of screaming civilians cleared and more shots pocked and pinged the car, the passengers dropped down to the floor of the car and Kawano's driver fell forward onto the steering wheel, dead. Kawano threw open his door and tumbled to the safety of the ground behind a wheel well. More shots echoed and ricocheted past him. Patting the right side of his face, Kawano pulled away his hand. His white glove was painted with his own brilliant red blood. "I've had enough of this." At the estate headquarters, the base officer casually blew cigarette smoke into the air as he watched a forest rat shoot across the lawn. The sound of a heavy vehicle slowly faded in, calling the rest of the soldiers to cautiously grab their weapons and look toward the end of the long driveway. The officer dropped his cigarette to the ground and crushed it, and curiously followed the armoured personnel carrier, lumbering toward them in a chorus of whining clanks and squeaks, finally coming to a grinding halt near the front steps in a cloud of diesel smoke. The passenger door flung open, banging against the steel side. Lieutenant General Kawano emerged from the beast, pressing a blood-soaked handkerchief to his face. The officer and soldiers immediately snapped to a salute, but were ignored as a scowling Kawano, dishevelled and splattered with mud, quickly stormed past the soldiers with his head down, clumped up the steps, jerked open the front door and furiously slammed it behind him, shattering the glass panes into a wall of shards that fell onto the brick entryway. The base commander stared at the door a moment as his saluting hand drifted down, looked over at a soldier, cocked his head, and shrugged. Captain Watanabe, a stout man in his 30s with glaring eyes, stood at attention before the desk of Lieutenant General Kawano. An able and experienced veteran of the Sino-Japanese War, Watanabe had also led battles against the Americans in Bataan on the Northern Island. Wearing a white headband of gauze, the general paced behind his desk. He paused and looked at Watanabe with his one open eye. "Wipe them out! Wipe them all out! Especially the Americans!" He began pacing again. "We control all of the islands except for this one. It's a disgrace. Begin from the coastal cities and work your way in toward the mountains. We know the guerrillas have hideouts and command posts, and we've picked up radio communications as well. They're giving our troop movements and shipping information to MacArthur, and now he's starting to supply them. This must be stopped, immediately. I want this island to be completely subdued. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Watanabe replied with a respectful bow of his head. "I don't care how you do it. Just get it done." Watanabe nodded. Among all of the Imperial Japanese Army commanders in the Philippines, perhaps in the entire empire, there was none better for this job than Captain Watanabe, and no one worse for the Filipinos. 10 miles northwest of Iloilo City, Japanese soldiers corralled over 700 townspeople into the barrio center as unwilling spectators. Watanabe's reputation had preceded his arrival. They'd heard of the Butcher of Panay, but they'd never seen him before. When he'd found suspects, he and his men beat them with bats, pumped their stomachs with water, and had them stomped to death. Others were burned alive. Women were raped in public. Children were beheaded. He eyed the terrified people. His katana dripped red as more blood oozed under the walls of a nearby hut and soaked into the dirt street. 22 severed Filipino heads rested in a heap near the front door, some of them of women and children. A limp arm dangled out through the doorway. A Japanese soldier shadowed Watanabe, shouting the translation for the crowd. "You think you can harbour guerrillas?" Watanabe shouted out. He pointed to the pile of bodies. Tiny droplets of red speckled Watanabe's face and shirt. He swung his sword in unpredictable gesticulations. "You think you can be a safe haven for people murdering our soldiers? Tell your friends," he yelled as he slowly strode from inside the circle. "Tell your neighbours. You help any guerrilla in any way. We will kill you, we will kill your family, and we will kill all of your friends. Maybe by sword this time, maybe by fire next." He stepped closer to the paralyzed people and eyed them one by one as he slowly walked around the circle. "Do you hear me?" August 1943. Nanking, China. Special treatment was what Jake was told they were to receive. Now he understood as he sat motionless, staring at the corner of his new cell in near-total darkness. Without explanation, earlier that spring, Jake and the 4 others were handcuffed, blindfolded, and flown to a new location. By peeking out of his blindfold and asking a few questions, he deduced that they'd been taken to Nanking, about 150 miles west of Shanghai. Hoping for perhaps a little more freedom, he was disappointed that the only really new thing was that he was given a name Go, Japanese for 5. He was the shortest prisoner and went in the last cell. Now he had a name, Number 5. But he and his fellow prisoners found names for their captors as well, like Einstein, Four Eyes, or Ape Ass. 23.5 hours a day, he sat in his 9-foot by 5-foot wooden cell, unable to talk or communicate with the others, except for the few minutes each day when they came out to brush their teeth and mop their cells. Even then, talking wasn't allowed, although sometimes a few words were tolerated. His treatment meant no books, no radio, no work, no play, no Red Cross packages, no letters in and no letters out. Nothing. Anything would have been better than nothing, he thought. Then again, some things could be worse. At least he wasn't being tortured. He did his best to keep his sanity by playing mental number games or recalling books in fine detail. His relief at escaping death, or at least postponing it, was slowly replaced by a numbing boredom. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month. All was becoming a monotonous blur. For months he and the others sought to eke out what bits of information they could from the guards on what had happened to their buddies. They were told a number of conflicting things. Then one day a smiling guard told them matter-of-factly, they were all shot. Upon seeing the look of fear on their faces, he quickly changed his story, saying they were transferred. As far as Jake was concerned, his best hopes were trampled, his worst fears realized. The main source of light in Jake's cell came in through an air vent, a wide slot at the top, 12 feet up. One day it crossed his mind that if he reached out his hands and feet, he might be able to place them on opposite sides of his cell across the narrow width and shimmy up the wall. He did just that and found he could slowly inch up the wall, so up he went, inch by inch. He knew if got caught, he could face a beating. He also knew if he fell in his weakened condition from 12 feet up, he could be badly injured or even killed. But the idea of seeing something, anything other than his 4 walls, urged him on, so up he went, inching up to the very top where he finally peered out. To his left he could see the yard, but to the right, well, to the right were hills and trees and sky. He tried to get a smell of fresh air, almost closing his eyes, when his left foot slipped just a fraction and jolted him back to reality. It was enough. He carefully shimmied the 12 feet back to the bottom and sat down, a little sore and a little tired. He smiled. Just to catch a glimpse of freedom. It was worth it. It was just outside his walls. Jake stood at his door with his face pressed against the small peephole, looking at his guard. "No hope for America," the guard said in English with a smile. "Everything go Japan's way. Only one Japanese plane sink many American ships. America start war, we finish. The power of Japan is unshakable. Our emperor, he is a god. We do not lose." "Is that so?" Jake replied. Even the guards were sometimes lonely for conversation and looked for opportunities to practice their English. Any conversation was welcomed, but Jake wasn't buying into the propaganda. And, what if Japan loses and America wins? Then what? The guard's face turned more serious. If Japan lose and America win, then prisoners not set free. He stared at Jake's eyes. "We cut off heads." The guard chuckled as he gleefully threw back his head and laughed again as he strode off. Jake wasn't amused. Of all the things the guard had told him, it was probably the only thing he said that was actually true. Under the watchful eye of roughly 10 guards at a time, the prisoners were sometimes allowed to walk laps around their square courtyard. Jake paired up with George Barr, the red-haired navigator from Brooklyn. "So, Jake," George whispered, "how's that diet plan coming along?" Barely moving his mouth, Jake soberly whispered back, "The pounds are just melting away." On the opposite side of the yard, Chase Nielsen walked beside his crew member, Bob Meader, who wasn't looking good. "Hey, pal, you okay?" Chase asked. Jake looked over with concern at Bob, who was nearly dragging his feet. The men felt a keen responsibility to take care of each other. The slightest infection in a degraded condition could easily mean death under these circumstances, and they all knew it. Bob squinted. Yeah, don't slow down for me. You go on." A guard zeroed in on Chase and leaned out from the other guards against the wall and shouted in Japanese, "Shut up! No talking!" Chase glanced over his shoulder as if to say he got the message, then leaned toward Bob again as they shuffled around the yard, whispering more quietly. "I'll set aside a little of my bread for you. We'll all pitch in a little too." "I said shut up! No talking!" Jake and the others stopped and watched with fear as the guard briskly strode toward Chase and came to a halt in the center of the yard. Jake knew that the only rule among the Japanese guards was that there weren't any rules. Anything could happen. Chase picked up his bucket and mop and started back for his cell, walking near the guard who unexpectedly slapped him across the face. Shocked, Chase stopped. Jake's pulse began to pound. Everyone stared. Showing no anger, Chase cleared his throat, slowly set down his mop and bucket, then violently slapped the guard across the face. The other guards sucked air through their teeth and took a few steps closer, but didn't intervene.